we go.
Yes, it looks good. So
Okay, good. Just let me know when you want me to start.
Okay. I'm That's interesting. I thought I spotlighted you. Okay. Um, Go ahead and welcome Tanner to Lorquin Entomological, and go ahead with your presentation, and we look forward to hearing it.
Okay, thank you so much, Kim. All right, so my talk tonight, a geometridologist journeys to Africa. It's gonna be a little discombobulated at the start. I'm going to talk a bit about global geometry and what's up there, and then kind of move into a recent trip in January I took to Africa, my first time on the continent, and very exciting and eye-opening for a guy that mostly works in the New World. So I cut my teeth at the University of Connecticut. I grew up in the Midwest, and then moved to the East Coast for grad school. But a lot of my research was done in California, where you guys are. So I worked on this group, this tribe, Stamnodini, which has New World representation, a few species in the Old World, but it's especially rich in the California floristic province. And what was so cool about this group is the caterpillars. Um, you're probably familiar with mountain mahogany, Cercocarpus, and the caterpillars in one of these subgroups of this tribe would just species pack like crazy on Cercocarpus. You might have 4 species on the same plant at the same time. And so that was an interesting direction, but largely it was life history work and systematics. And so I was educated at UConn. I got my master's degree and PhD there under the advisorship of David Wagner, who's a mentor and more than a colleague. He's a very close friend. He's someone I call when I'm excited about some new discovery or have a biological question. But he's probably most famous. He does a lot of work, but probably most famous for his book Caterpillars of Eastern North America. And he's working on a sequel to Western North America, which is exciting and something I've had the opportunity to tag along while I did my PhD research. I was in California and then also helping him with collections for this book. So I learned a lot through that. Um, and that's also where I met David Weichel, who set this up, invited me to speak. I'm going to put a plug in. Dave just finished another book. I don't know what he's up to, maybe like 10 or something now. But this one is Moths of the World in Natural History. And I think anybody interested in moths, this is a great primer. Talks about the major lineages, their diversity, their geography, and then just like all sorts of cool anecdotes and facts and distinguishing characters. And what I really like about Dave's writing is he tells you what we know, but he also likes to throw in what we don't know and just leave sort of questions there for the reader that can make you sort of impassioned to go discover these for yourself. So that comes out in April. So I encourage anyone that's interested in moths to buy it. So here's Dave Weichel, the man that invited me, and everyone that knows Dave, or we call him Wykes, is he's quite a character. And I looked on the internet for a good image, and I was actually surprised. He looks so put together here. I was expecting more mischief, but then I looked kind of a little deeper into the image, and he has his monitor turned on and his favorite insect genitals on the screen. So I suppose there's the mischief in the image. But um, Dave Weichel would always be on the phone with us, Dave Wagner and I, as we were out west searching for caterpillars, because we were interested in larval biology, and we were always after these new life histories, and we're trying to figure it out with phylogenetics and context and auger and new life history. And eventually, it became so common on our trips, we'd be calling Dave Weichel, and you have some crazy theory about what the caterpillar was on that we called these Weichel goose chases. So we'd go on Weichel goose chases. I just wanted to highlight one story from that. We were in West Texas in the Big Bend region, not in the Chisos Mountains, but rather down lower. And it's just wild country. It's like extraterrestrial kind of feeling. There's these gypsum soils that are really high in magnesium, and almost nothing can grow there. But there's this moth here. I'm sorry, this poor image because it's really rare. There's not many images of it. It's a Grotella margaritaria. And I think there was, I don't know if there was some knowledge of what it might feed on, or the Daves were predicting, but it was most likely on this nyctaginaceous plant that was a specialist on these gypsum soils. And we usually collect along the road with beating sheets, and I don't think this caterpillar had ever been photographed. And so we were in this Texas landscape along the side of the road on what I believe to be a Weichel goose chase. And we crossed over a barbed wire fence because there was a great stand of this plant just on the other side. And we didn't think much of it. This fence wasn't much put together. And we were over there collecting for a few minutes, and all of a sudden, this truck feels like it's coming like 50 miles an hour down a dirt road. The dust flying in the back comes right to us to a screeching halt. There's a gun rack in the back, and they just rip into us for trespassing. And so we got, a licking. So there's two things I learned that day because we ended up getting the caterpillar and photographing it, I believe, for the first time, was that, Weichel goose chase sometimes turns out, and also don't cross fences in Texas. All right, so to the geometridae, which is what I study, the second most diverse family of Lepidoptera, second to rabbits, I believe, runs the gamut in terms of adult phenotypes. So you have Eupithecia, they're called the pugs. I call them the ugly puglies. They're very small and gray, and there's over 2,000 species and probably hundreds more that are undescribed. It's the most diverse genus of Geometridae. And then what Richard and I were talking about, earlier before we started the Zoom, is this genus Dysphanis, which is in Asia, which is just remarkable, gorgeous. And then I threw in a selfish plug here. This is Stamnodes fergusoni on the bottom, also a geometrid, and one I had the privilege to describe from Texas. I think it's one of the most beautiful moths in the Nearctic region. Geometrids, there's 9 subfamilies, but 4 make up pretty much the core of the diversity. And there's about 2,000 genera and 24,000 or so described species, a little less. But they're recognized, the adults are they're more slender than a noctuid or noctuoid or a bombicoid. And usually the hindwing pattern extends into the forewing pattern extends into their hindwing, a little bit weaker flyers. But the main adult character is that they have these tympana, these listening devices on the base of their abdomen. So you can always look under a microscope and tell whether it's a geometrid. Now, there are some other groups like pyraloids that also have tympana, but they don't have an ansa, which is this cross-bracing structure that you see. The caterpillars are very easy to recognize. They have reduced sets of prolegs. So on A6 and A10, they have prolegs. The anal prolegs are A10, whereas a lot of other caterpillars have prolegs on A3, A4, A5, A6, and A10. So reduced prolegs, that gives them this inching motion where they get their names, earth measures, geometry. The diversity is worldwide. And there's about, I'd say, 1 out of every 4 described species is from the neotropics. And I expect there to be a lot. There's so many undescribed species from the neotropics. I expect 1 out of every 3, when it's all said and done, will be from the neotropics. And in the Arctic, we're actually relatively not that diverse compared to other places. Glaciation has had a say in that. But there's about 1,440 species or so. But I've been doing some exciting work recently where I've been DNA barcoding a bunch of species I kind of regard as dubious. I'm not really sure they're good species. And I've been DNA barcoding paratypes and syntypes, whatever museum collection managers will let me get my hands on. And I'm up to a few dozen species that I the DNA, the molecular evidence, and the weak morphological evidence for these species suggests that they're not good. So I actually expect that number to decrease in time in the Arctic region. Despite this diversity in the neotropics and the Arctic zone where I work, there's relatively little study. There's almost nobody in the New World doing geometrid systematics and life history work. I think in the Arctic, you have Cliff Ferris and Chris Schmidt who've done some work, but not much else. And there's a couple maybe in the neotropics that publish here and there. But in the last 20 years, this is showing that about one paper a year is published taxonomic on geometry and about 2.5 in the neotropics per year. So that's very poor considering what gets published in the Palearctic and Oriental regions. So just touching on why so many, there's the second most diverse family. It's an extremely successful lineage, numerically abundant, probably the most important lineage, of terrestrial metazoans in a lot of forested ecosystems and temperate zones. Why so many? There's 24,000. And I think I'm going to answer my own question. I think that a lot of that has to do with the art of going missing. They're exceptional escape artists. They know how to camouflage and decorate themselves. And there is even some, this is crazy. There's a paper in, I think it was 2019. It was about the pepper moth, the same one that Kettlewell studied in Europe when there's the industrialization and you got a selection for darker individual adults. That same moth, there was a study where they blinded it, blinded its ocelli, its eyes, if you will, and it was still able to match the color of the substrate and its integument. So it actually has extraocular dermal receptors that read the leaf or the stick that it's on and will match that color. So they're amazing at not being seen by birds. So here are a few examples. Some of these are a little older pictures, so they're a little bit blurry, but they still illustrate my point. Beautiful, very, very well hidden. Pretty much everything on juniper has this phenotype, or Juniper cupressus, and it's really hard actually to tell the caterpillars apart when they're all converging on the same phenotype. This one, of course, you can see that you can tell a lot about a caterpillar by what it looks like. In this case, you can read its biology. It rests on twigs and it doesn't rest on leaves because of its phenotype. There's another beautiful, twig mimic. In the larger image here, you have two caterpillars in the subfamily Geometrini. These are the ones that turn green. You can see they just look like leaves. A lot of geos use belay lines and just to hold themselves in place. They'll actually do that, but they'll actually drop from the foliage as well to escape largely ants and other insect predators, spiders probably. One of my favorite examples is Selenia. On the left-hand side here, you can see it's on a leaf, not very camouflaged, but as soon as it starts resting on the twig, man, it looks just like a smaller branch that's been snapped off. It even has a scar, looks like a scar, under its thorax there where it's holding its head. It's remarkable. Some of them are cross-dressers. They put petals on themselves and adorn themselves so that they won't be seen. This is a Synchlora, another emerald moth that's on Ericameria in this case, another plant you might be familiar with in California. And so that brings me to where I am now, so that was a little primer on geometry. But right now I'm at the Smithsonian working on a postdoc, and I'm actually focusing on Central American moths, particularly the data set of Dan Jansen and Winnie Hallwachs in Costa Rica. This is the largest data set of reared Lepidoptera in the world. A phenomenal amount of effort has been put into this, and just tens of thousands of geometrid moths have come to the Smithsonian, and I'm working up some of the systematics and larval biology, publishing on that with Dan and Winnie. So if this is the case, why am I talking about Africa, and how do I even have the I don't have the knowledge to begin this discussion on Africa. Largely, I'm not going to talk about African geometry, rather sort of a trip and an adventure that I was recently able to go on, and then a little bit about what's going on there. Now, this trip in January I took to Africa was initially because there was a Forum Herbalo meeting in South Africa scheduled for this year in January. And Forum Herbalo, I think, is probably unfamiliar to most people that aren't geometric workers. This was started in 2001 to honor, the name was honoring Claude Herbalo, a taxonomist, French taxonomist that mostly worked in um, Africa, Madagascar, and not much in the New World, a little bit, but he's pictured here in the center. And this Congress, this first Congress, was initiated by the global geometrid working community, and it's become something we do every 2 years. It's highly collaborative. A lot of selfless and humble people have contributed to this, and it's just made a remarkable atmosphere for anyone who wants to study geometric moths. I think there's nothing like it elsewhere in Lepidoptera. So the meeting was to be held in South Africa on the heels of this book, South African Moths and Their Caterpillars by Herman Stout, who was our host, tremendous scientist and host, and just a lovely guy to speak with. And so that was the second half of my trip, was this Forum Herbalo meeting. But the first part was kind of more of the adventure. So I had the opportunity to go to Mozambique and Gorongosa National Park, which is heralded as one of the most successful conservation stories in Africa. And my contact there was Peter Niskreki, who's a pretty well-regarded scientist in his own right, and an esteemed photographer, conservationist, and writer. And he's one of the head scientists there at Gorongosa National Park. Also spent some time in Costa Rica, and I think he teaches here and there, maybe at Harvard. I know he's affiliated with Harvard in some ways. But Gorongosa National Park is at the center of Mozambique there. And so my connection from Peter was through my major professor, Dave Wagner, who's been starting to guest lecture in Africa at Gorongosa National Park. The national park has its own master's program. It's the first of its kind. And it's a master's program in conservation biology. There's none like it in Mozambique, and it's the first time ever they've had such a program in that country. And Dave, as a conservationist, as a caterpillar biologist, and someone who's looking out for nature, sees it as sort of an opportunity to really give back, because we're going to see a lot of environmental, social conflict, even more than we see now in Africa in the next few decades. The population is expected to explode to nearly double what it is now by 2050, and probably quadruple before it levels out. And a lot of these communities are subsistence living off the land, and we've kind of had our day in US and Europe, where we've destroyed our environments, but here there's still a lot of pristine environment that is at risk, and with population growth in the future. So just a little bit of a backstory about Mozambique to give you some history of the country. This was kind of mostly new to me, I must confess, as well. African history is not something I'm well read on, but improving here. So before the 16th century, Mozambique was inhabited largely by Bantu-speaking people, and they played a crucial role in the spice trade, the Indian Ocean trade network, China to India to the Middle East, and then the east coast of Africa here. And then in 1498, Portuguese explorer Vasco da Gama claimed Mozambique as a Portuguese colony, and it was ruled by the Portuguese for 400 plus years. They exploited the country for its trade, agriculture, and labor. And then there was a war for for independence, or excuse me, independence from Portugal was declared in 1975 with a communist revolution. And this led to uh, 15 years of civil war between the communist-led government and the anti-communist rebel militia. So I was actually Monday. I was in at the American Museum in New York City and doing some work there. And I was invited to a talk of a friend who was a war correspondent in Central America while the Sandinistas and the Contras were battling out. And it was very similar. I was amazed by the parallels in here, communist-led government and then an American-backed. It was mostly covert in Africa, but American-backed rebel militia. And then post-war in 1992, a peace agreement was signed, and Mozambique became a multi-party democracy. But there's still quite a lot of poverty, and political corruption remains quite strong there. And so that brings me to this image. The next few images I can't not claim as my own. These are Peter's, who's a professional photographer. So they were much better than the images I took on the trip. And he was so generous to allow me to share some of these. But this was a floodplain we frequented a couple times. We do sundowners. This is a really cool tradition where they'd go down and watch the sunset, listen to the animals, and watch the animals on the plains. And they drank this hard cider called, I think it was Savannah. I hope I'm not wrong on that. It was a South African hard cider, and I guess this is just like tradition they do in South Africa and other South African countries. But I like this image because it shows a lot of the history of the park and Gorongosa. You have in the foreground a tremendous amount of, these are water bucks, I believe, a type of antelope. And this was not something you saw during the Civil War. During the Civil War, almost the entire large mammal populations were wiped out for food. And during, both sides of them, both militaries were in this area fighting, and pretty much all the large animals were gone. And then you can look a little farther and you can see some buildings. These were built by the Portuguese. This is actually called the Lion House because they'd come here to watch lions, and it was kind of a picnic spot. But it's a floodplain, so it eventually flooded several times, and I think it just became less used. But after the war, after the revolution, they were asked the Mozambicans were trying to get rid of a lot of the Portuguese buildings, but this one somehow these were spared. And then if you look even further into the background, you see Mount Gorongosa, and this was actually more recently acquired by the park. And that is where a lot of the endemic and sort of the imperiled taxa are going to be, because you have high elevation, different climate. This mountain that rises up out of the plain. So there's a lot of amazing discoveries to be had up there, and it's so worth protecting. And I hope that that continues to be successful. Uh, so while I was in Africa, we were largely initiating a caterpillar biology project. I mentioned that, I believe I mentioned that master's program, the first of its kind. Yeah. And this is Lizzie, who's just starting out, and we were kind of training her on how to collect and photograph caterpillars. She's a very fast learner, and she's going to do so well. And in the middle image, you can see Tara, who's been in Gorongosa for a long time and is kind of acting as her mentor. And she's an ecologist that looks at, native plants and coffee and vegetation plots. And I'm sure I'm screwing up her research here, so I should probably stop talking. And then you can see Dave there a little further, Dave Wagner a little further in the background. So in this trip, we got several caterpillars. We have absolutely no idea what they're going to turn out to be. And so we're going to DNA barcode them and match the larva to the adult. And usually with Lepidoptera, there's a pretty good reference library that's been, gleaned from collections. So we can match a lot of these. But this was just an absolute sausage. This guy is, it's a Lasiocampa. We collected on top of the mountain, probably the last caterpillar we collected. And it really is the size of a hot dog. It was massive. It was so big we couldn't take a picture with the macro lens. We had to take it, the one on the right, the full body shot is actually a cell phone shot. It was so big. This is a Saturniid, Rick. This one's for you. This one is a known life history, but it was fairly common. This is something kind of close to Zolly in the U.S. if you're familiar. Um, and what I love about these caterpillars is to the naked eye, they look gray when you first collect them, and you blow them up with a nice macro photograph, and it's not gray, it's orange, and sometimes some purples in there, and spotted black and white, and just becomes really intriguing very quickly. Some of these others, I have no idea what they'll turn out to be. Here's some more beautiful caterpillars from this trip to Africa. If Dave Weigel is here, you might recognize the agaristines at the bottom right. We have several of those in the U.S. Here's some just small hairy guys. I was most excited about the one in the middle because it's I think, I don't know yet, we'll see what the data says, but I think it's a lacturid, which is a group I studied for my master's project. So it's closer to home, so I'm excited to see what the DNA results will be there. And so, that's largely what we did there was train and Lizzie and work on caterpillars, and Dave Wagner will be going back to teach every year, hopefully. But it was also there for selfish reasons. We were there for a little bit of an adventure, especially for me who haven't been to Africa before. And so I had to walk this tightrope, this delicate balance between, talking up the adventure explorer persona that, I think a lot of entomologists, like to have people think of them. And then, also not talk the danger up so much that my wife wouldn't let me go. So that was a delicate balance, but one of the things I was excited about seeing were all the snakes that were in this region. They have spitting cobras and black mambas and puff adders, but I actually didn't see any snakes while I was there. And then right before we went, there was a little bit of political unrest after a recent election, so that was also something we're concerned about. But when I was in Mozambique, I felt safe the entire time. There was no issues with anything. And so the next few pictures I'm going to go through, this is more of the travel log part, and just talk about some things that I found peculiar as someone that's only seen New World biology and not been to this continent or this area of Africa. And the first was just the sheer number of animals, large mammals. I mean, it's like nothing you've ever seen. And this is a huge rebound. Like I said before, there was almost all these populations were decimated. And then in about 2004, I think they started the Gorongosa Restoration Project, which was a private-public partnership between the Mozambican government and a guy named Greg Carr, who made his fortune with voicemail. So he was one of the original marketers of voicemail. But his passion to conserve this park, and it's been highly successful. So yeah, everywhere you turn, you see animals. But if you leave the park, which has no fences, it's protected by park rangers, but there's no fences. If you leave the park, you don't see a single animal. And that's because they're hunted for bush meat, and you can't, the people there don't, outside of the park are pretty poor and don't have a lot of protein options. So it's understandable. But within the park, they often catch poachers, and this is a shed at the headquarters there where they've put tools of the poachers that they've confiscated. Foot traps. They like to use snares. Of course, there's guns in the foreground there. And then this is a picture taken by Peter, so it had to include a bat to make it even more interesting. Peter loves bats. Um, Also on the same theme of the Civil War and poaching, most of the elephants were taken out during the war, and elephants have phenomenal memory, and they pass that memory down into subsequent generations. And so these guys saw their kin murdered, and they remember that. And so elephants elsewhere in the world, you might think of as gentle giants. In this part of Africa, very much not so. They're very dangerous, and they will take on a truck, no problem, flip you over. Any human that's on foot and can't get away, you're scrambled eggs. It's not good. So we really respected the elephants. I saw two while I was there, but they weren't very common. You could see their sign everywhere. They knock down trees over the road all the time. Another formidable animal is the hippo. This is like a lot of these images I'm showing you, Peter's taken over the course of several years, but this one he took while we were there. So this was the hippo that I saw the first time. It's not in the river. It's actually on the savannah, quite a ways away from the river. And we were driving in the truck, and I saw this hippo, and I said, "I just saw a hippo," and I'd let everyone know in the front of the truck. And we backed up because we passed some brush, and we backed up and there was no hippo. And no one believed me. They're like, I'm making things up. I'm like, how do I make up a 3,000 pound animal? But we ended up going a little bit further ahead after no one believed me, and the hippo was right in the middle of the road. So I proved them all wrong. It was great. And we got to see this beautiful animal. And we also were very respectful of its space. There's something that it'll charge a truck to. And they're extremely dangerous, but absolutely amazing. Just to put it into size perspective, that's my size 13 boot in between the jaws of this was actually supposedly a young male, maybe like a teenage male hippo. So not even full grown, and look at the size of that thing. Absolutely massive. One unusual aspect of Africa is, on your way to any building, you might trip over a warthog. These guys love to be on the concrete. It was cool there. It was hot. We were there during the rainy season. It's hot and humid. And so they all love the concrete. And they also had a bad habit of peeing everywhere on the concrete. So you'd see like little puddles of warthog pee. And since we're talking about pee, I thought I'd transition to poop as well. The dung beetle fauna was absurd. I was not prepared to see the number of dung beetles that I saw there. It's just highly diverse. And these guys are turning over so much of these large animals poo all the time. I think this was elephant, probably, I imagine, this picture. But even right outside of my cabin, the baboons, I'll show you here, here's a baboon. The baboons would poop and the dung beetles would be right on it in seconds. No, this is a really majestic picture, and that's Peter's handiwork. But I'm going to pass a moral judgment here and say that baboons might be the most delinquent of all animals in the park. I don't know if you guys have seen Tarzan, but this is what it reminded me of, the baboons. They would be on the ground during the day, but at night they'd go up into the trees and they'd roost in the trees overnight. But then about 5 o'clock in the morning, without fail, every morning, right before sunrise, they would come down from the trees and have a party on your tin roof. I mean, they would just bang it and crash it, and totally obnoxious. And then they would come to your porch and turn your doorknobs because they were checking doors to see if they could get in and steal some food. And they even, so everywhere on the park, they have to lock every door. So you're always walking around with keys. And then even if you leave the key in the lock, sometimes the baboons will turn the key and try to get in. So they're after human food at whatever cost. And if they get into your house, they just make an absolute wreck of it. And they get so excited, they start pooping everywhere. It's awful. I've heard it didn't happen when I was there. And then even at the cafeteria for the park workers, They have a guy with a slingshot that just keeps the baboons away at all times. So what an interesting occupation. One animal I didn't have the privilege of seeing, I wanted to, but we just didn't get it done, was the African wild dogs. But just because I didn't see it doesn't mean I didn't smell it. So they stink terribly. And we were passing through where a pack had recently traveled one day and we could smell them, but we didn't see them. We did see lions. There's about 250 in the park. They weren't super common to see, but you could hear them at dusk. You could hear their low guttural communication to each other. But one night we went and checked out. They have a clearing in the park in the forest for the bush planes to come through, and it's quite large. And all the animals congregate there and graze on the grass in the clearing. And one night, a lioness and her two cubs were out there. um, presumably she would hunt that night, a warthog or one of the antelopes, an impala maybe. But we didn't see that, but we were privileged enough to see the lioness, and we were never in danger. Of course, we weren't getting out of the trucks, but when I tell my friends the story about seeing the lions, I do tell them that it was about a third of a mile away from where my cabin was, and there was really no continuous fence in between us. There was some fencing, but not a continuous fence. The lions would have no business in the camp. They don't think they would go there, but still, I like to say I was walking around at night, no fences, a third mile away from the lion pack. Speaking of danger, this is a beautiful image, but the most dangerous animal outside of mosquitoes, which I don't even consider the same category, large animal, is crocodiles. Crocodiles take more human life in Mozambique than any other large animal. We even had a guy that worked at the park that lost two siblings to crocodiles on two separate occasions. Anybody washing their clothes or fishermen just crossing, these animals have evolved to take down large mammals, and humans are just that. So even small bodies of water, puddles, we were really cautious around. That was sort of the safari type encounters, but the insect biology. This is one of the things I really wanted to see. Was there's these Tiniid moths that eat the animal horns. There's keratin specialists, and yeah, just about every skull I found with horns had these cases on it where the moths had fed or were actively feeding. So that was really neat. This is an excerpt from that book, South African Moths and Their Caterpillars, that Herman Stout and others wrote. And I mentioned earlier, I studied lacturid moths for my master's degree. In the same superfamily, a very closely related sister family, is the Hymenopterids. And this is something I've never seen. They're old world. And they're the ones here with the tails, that beautiful black and orange moth with the tails. And I didn't think I was going to have the privilege to see one in real life, but this was right outside of my cabin one day, and I got a photograph of this male on the right-hand side here. And I know it's a simple pleasure, but that actually really made my day, seeing that and seeing a family I haven't ever seen before. What cool moths, and almost nothing's known about them. So, we don't really. There's a few that they know what their life history are, but it's pretty much an open field. Ants, termites are the keystone species in the forest. The termite mounds are everywhere. Some are as big as small houses, and there's communities, communities of plants and animals that depend on these termite mounds and what the termites do. And then I had the privilege of seeing several ant raids where the ants would go and take the termites and march in a line across the forest floor. Just remarkable, all the warfare and just sort of the drama that's playing out on the forest floor. The butterflies were exceptional, absolutely beautiful, very numerous. My favorites, you guys will like this. You have orange tips in California. which the first time I saw a California orange tip, that blew my mind. That was enough for me. I couldn't stop chasing after those guys that day. But in Africa, or at least in Mozambique here, they have purple tips. So imagine a slightly larger orange tip, but with sort of this iridescent, sheeny purple tip. Remarkable. Probably my favorite butterfly I saw on the trip. And so just to wrap things up here, most of this African part was Mozambique, but we ended up going to South Africa, of course, for the Forum Herbalo meeting. This is the members of that meeting. Exceptional talks, a continuation of this highly collaborative atmosphere, and just a lot of great science is coming out of this group. We're marching forward on really comprehensive phylogenetic data sets. So we're going to have about 3,400 terminal taxa in the next iteration of our phylogeny, which essentially at that point you can stitch in DNA barcodes and kind of match things to genera. Just the utility of that is phenomenal. And then we also have an online catalog now, a checklist, if you will, of not a checklist, but a catalog of the global geometrid fauna. And right now it doesn't have like type localities. It might have like a general type locality, but not specifics. But it's going to have all the data that a systematist or anyone needs for these species. So just wonderful things. It's a wonderful group of people to be a part of, and a great privilege to go to Africa. And so I'll just finish with these, majestic kudos and one of the most impressive antelopes there that we saw. And I will take any questions that you all have. And thank you for inviting me. And I appreciate the opportunity. And yeah, thank you.
Thank you. That was fabulous. If people want to take themselves off mute now, um, and we can go to Q&A.
So Tanner, can the average person collect in Mozambique? Were you able to collect and bring back boxes of fun stuff?
That's a good question. So the you can collect. We collected in the park, and the material is property of the park, and we have it on sort of on loan. But it's no problem, getting the loan from, Peter essentially writes the loan. And so, yeah, as long as the park gets names, essentially, that's what they're interested in, is sort of biodiversity survey of the park. I'm sure there's more specifics, and it depends on what institution you're part of and what country you're coming from and stuff. But for us, it was relatively easy.
So you said you didn't want to show your wife the scary bits before. Has she seen them since you've come back?
No, yeah, she knows that she, I never actually was in any danger, I felt, so there was scary bits, but of course you have to embellish it for your friends. I just don't embellish it for my wife. I go the other direction. It's completely safe. Everything was cushioned. Nothing was, no issues.
I really appreciate seeing all of this that I probably will not get to in person, but it's
Yeah,
really fantastic.
yeah, for me, I think it's one of those opportunities of a lifetime. I don't see myself pursuing, I have so much to do in the new world, and that's where my knowledge base is right now. So it's going to be hard to start working in Africa. So really, this was a major adventure. And then also I had that meeting at the end where I got to finally meet a lot of my colleagues, people I've emailed for many years. So that was great.
Could you say a little bit more about you mentioned those pepper moths? I assume you're talking about the larvae and they blinded them. And
Yeah,
how do they respond? Is it you put them on a substrate or a plant, and do they have to molt a few times before they
yeah, good
come
question.
different? Is that how it works?
Yeah, good question. Yeah, so So they changed between instars. And so they would they'd put them on like a green or a brown twig, and they'd blind them, and they would sort of read the substrate, and then after their next molt, they'd change to that color. Um,
Wow,
and
that's
so
something.
they even did some, I think, where they'd do like a banded twig, and it
Uh-huh.
would be like 3/4 brown and 1/4 green. And I believe the paper is ECOC et al. 2019,
Hmm.
but you could check me on this, but I believe that, whichever one had whichever color was the majority color is what they turned into.
Oh, that's something. Yeah.
Yeah, it's really something.
Were you able or did you do any lighting on these trips? Running
Yeah,
some
yeah,
lights? Yeah.
we ran a sheet every night, and there was um I'd actually say the caterpillar collecting was better than the
Hmm.
adult collecting. We did much better. As a geometrid guy, there actually wasn't that many geometrids at the sheet, maybe like, I don't know, 20 species, maybe.
Hmm.
But there was all this other wild stuff that, I was so unfamiliar with, families I didn't even know existed. It's a whole different place. For Richard there was definitely Saturniids and other bombicoids and stuff, but it, um, I would say that we were maybe a little bit early on the adult collecting.
Hmm.
It hadn't rained much when it was hot right before we got there, and then the skies unleashed while we were there. So I think things were a little behind.
Hmm.
Do you want to stop sharing your screen now and
Yeah,
we'll bring
sure.
everyone else in? And I think that Dave, I'm going to remove your spotlight. And I see that Dave has joined us now. And it's great
Great.
to see Mike, who you're on mute. Um, great presentation.
Thank you.
Yes, indeed. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
It- you talked about the dangers, so I will share one of my dangers, which was when we were camping at Tajon Ranch, and Dave, I think it was you, who next to your cot had a baby rattlesnake
Oh,
Hmm.
yeah.
while we were camping.
Yeah, well, I was talking about the dangers, and I was thinking about venomous snakes, because if you get tagged by a venomous snake there, getting to a hospital quickly is not an easy thing to do. And they don't, I don't know how close anti-venom would be. So, there's danger, and then you have the crocodiles and the large animals. But honestly, what ended up getting me in the end was a thorn. I like my first day, I got a big thorn in my leg, and it started to swell up a little bit. So I had to go to the clinic and get some antibiotics. But yeah, so instead of talking up the snakes and the hippos and the crocodiles, I had to say, like, had a 6-inch thorn in my leg. When it was more like a centimeter, maybe.
So, Tanner, could you talk a couple minutes about the food you ate while you were there?
Did someone prompt you to say that?
No.
Okay. Yeah, I didn't touch on that. So when I was in Mozambique, I ate at the worker cafeteria, and it was the off season. So there was, I don't know, maybe 50 to 100 people that would eat there a day. During the peak season, it would be several hundred, I think. And this is a place where there's not plenty, and so I um, have a hard time complaining about the food, but the food wasn't good. It was too, like, you'd have a lot of starch, so it'd be like 2 big scoops of rice, maybe most days. Some days they'd have cornmeal that they'd mix with water, and other days maybe cassava. I never had the cassava, but I definitely had the cornmeal. It was like the consistency of mashed potatoes. um but very little protein. So like I like when we did have beef one time, we had 3 meals in a row where it was beef hoof, And so there was no muscle. It was just tendon, skin, and bone on top of rice. And like for my East Coast American palate, that was a little challenging. I think I might have lost a little weight because I just can only eat tendon so much. And then the next day, they like after those like 3 meals of the hoof, they moved up the cow leg, and we started eating shank. And so there was a little bit more muscle. And then finally, like the fifth meal, we had some, some thigh protein from the cow. So but we had little picnic style sunsets, the sundowners I mentioned. We'd have, pickles or, some pate or some cheese or something that was nice as a smaller group.
I took 3 students to South Africa in 2018, and we stayed a few days at Kruger National Park.
Yeah.
And in the store there, at our camp, we bought kudu and impala. Anyway, 2 or 3 kinds of steaks, and we cooked them out on the grill. And we bought bell peppers and onions and put them on shish kebabs, and it was a lot of fun.
Yeah, that sounds very, very good. But when we went on to the local villages and the community, especially the trip that we took from the lowlands and up into the mountain, which was quite a trek. Um, they'd have food vendors, and I'm used to going to Mexico for my field research or, other, Central America, where the food vendors are everywhere. You can't go a block without running into a taco stand or, someone selling food. But there in Mozambique, at least in this province, I can't speak for the entire country. They really had just seasonal fruit and some eggs that they were selling on the side, but nothing that was like put together meals, like you couldn't go get a Mozambican dish, just they didn't have pre-prepared food.
Your hoof soup sounds like when I was in China, I ate some chicken foot soup.
Yeah. The collagen in the broth around that they boiled down the hooves in was so thick that you would put it on your rice and it was like instant pudding. It was so thick. I mean, I ate it the first meal. I was like, yeah, I can handle this for one meal. But by the second and third meal, I was like, I don't think I'm gonna eat bananas today.
Well, I will end the